Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 220, and we're going to talk about the military draft and in the context of uh, the latest news. I was listening to Ron Paul's podcast, and he talked about how a missile battery was sent to Israel, uh, which to help shore up their Iron Dome, which I said before is basically non-existent. It's a myth. And we saw how ineffective it was with Iran's missile barrage, which targeted military targets, I should add. And just like how the United States would shoot missiles and let everyone know where the missiles are going to land so that no one would die. So Iran did the same. But of course, Israel is not extending the same courtesy to the countries at which it fires off its missiles. But the key thing to note is that a lot of the missiles got through, that in spite of the so-called Iron Dome, a lot of missiles got through. And this is in part because of the strategy that is used, which I discussed before. I even talked about it with my kids, and they knew right away. Of course, if you know how your opponent is setting up their defense, all you have to do is figure out how to defeat that defense. And as it turns out, it's a low cost way, right? So if a missile is coming in, no matter how old or cheap it is, you have to shoot it down. And so the ratio of costs, a $20,000 missile shot down by $4 million, right? Or each missile is 2 million, I think I heard, in the Patriot system anyway, 2 million each. And so you have to fire two at once. And so you're shooting $4 million for a $20,000 rocket, right? And so the math just does not add up. Obviously, the United States and anyone who employs the military strategy of the United States is going to lose, right? You just overwhelm them with a lot of cheap missiles, which forces them to shoot these really expensive rockets, which they can only, uh, anti-missile missiles, which they can only produce a few hundred per year or something like that. And so they burn through their entire supply. And so what's left? They just keep firing cheap missiles. And also, if you want to really humiliate, Israel or any other country, you just shoot your hypersonic missiles, which nothing can stop at this time. So imagine if they're not just shooting at empty airfields, but they're targeting people now. Yeah, it'll be a slaughter. And I've said that before, and you know, I'm on a rant. So let's get back to the subject, shall we? So draft talk is floating around again, and it's a sad topic because basically it's straight up coercion. You are forcing people to join the military. I would not be surprised if they start doing here what they're doing in the Ukraine. In other words, they mentioned how it's the lowest selective service registration ever. And so fewer and fewer people are, going along with this idea that they will join the military by force and then go and, risk their entire life, the future of their life, because of some political cause, because of some, uh, you know, uh, corporate cause. They're just unwilling to do it, right? So what's happening in the Ukraine, of course, is that people are kidnapped off the streets. This is called press gangs, right? So I first heard about it in England when people would press into service, people walking around or who are former criminals given the option to either go to prison or go on a ship. They press them into service on Navy ships, right? Because once you hit the sea, you rarely come home, and so you're away from your family, you're away from all these loved ones, and life on a boat is rough, right? Not only once you get over the seasickness, is it cramped? Is there's no privacy, but then you have the risk of sudden death if you get into a naval battle. And so people had to be forced into naval service. And they would just basically walk around, and if you see someone, they would press them into service. And so that's what's happening in the Ukraine. You have people just wandering around looking for people to kidnap off the streets. And so the only exemption that you can get is if you can pay a fee. You pay a certain amount, you pay off these press gangs so that they leave you alone, or you escape the country. And a lot of people are trying to escape the country, but at the same time, you have a lot of people guarding the borders, trying to make sure that they can't leave the country. And there are, if you've seen the videos, you see all of these various ways that people try to smuggle people out of the country. In other words, they're trafficking humans. So whenever you restrict the flow of traffic, there is always going to be human trafficking. And in this case, people who want to escape being pressed into the Ukrainian military, where they will die within a month, they will be willing to risk going to jail, fines, or whatever. But I have a feeling that when they get caught at the border, they're just simply sent on to the front. And having coerced, kidnapped soldiers to be your soldiers, that's not a very good thing, right? It's actually pretty horrifying if you think about it. If the battle erupts, they all run away, but they were ordered not to retreat, and so as they're retreating, they get shot. I've seen those videos. It's terrible, right? So standing with Ukraine means forcing people to die for a war that is already lost, right? The war is already lost. It's been lost, but we still keep sending money over there, and they still go through the motions, and no one cares, right? All those people virtue signaling, saying, "Oh, I stand with Ukraine. Oh, we got to do the right thing because Putin's evil." It's disgusting. It's disgusting how evil that kind of behavior is. They have no clue as to what's going on. They sit at their keyboard and they virtue signal. Maybe, I don't know what kind of benefit or who believes that garbage, but it's disgusting, right? I've already talked about how cemeteries are getting so massive that they are, they're just getting bigger and bigger. I mean, if you are burying over 600,000 soldiers that died already, then that's a lot of cemetery space. And so BlackRock bought something like, I don't know, 46% of the land in Ukraine. They bought it, right? And so BlackRock issued a statement that said, stop burying people in the ground that we bought, right? Cremate them, right? Cremate. It's just so crazy how this country is down and out, right? The Ukraine is down and out. And so you get a big corporation like BlackRock that only has its money that it has because of all the money printing that goes on over here. And they're buying up land all over the place. It's so beyond belief disgusting. All right. Reminds me of a quote that I had said before, but I'll repeat here because it is apropos. War. What is war? It's a massacre of people who don't know each other for the profit of people who know each other but don't massacre each other. It's by Paul Valéry. It's a French poet, writer, person. I'll repeat it. War is a massacre of people who don't know each other for the profit of people who know each other but don't massacre each other, right? And so you have these people who are ordering the deaths of all of these people, right? Because they're trying to get at an enemy, right? But neither those people nor their enemy are going to enter the battlefield ever. Just a bunch of strangers murdering each other because they believed a lie, because they believed a story, a propaganda story that their government taught them. So war, let's remember, war is the worst human activity that humans can engage in, right? It's not productive. It's a misallocation of resources. There's profiteering on death and destruction. And then all that death, all that lost human life, right? Not just of the soldiers, but of all of the collateral damage, so-called, the dead women and children who get caught up in all that fighting. It's like the broken window fallacy on steroids, right? So, oh, but it'll be great for the economy if we, blow up that building because now people have to repair it. It'll make the economy go great. But of course, if the building never was blown up, then you can use all of that money and resource instead of rebuilding just to get back to where you were before, but to improve something, to, advance something, to build something new. So now you have two buildings. And then, of course, you have all of that PTSD and everything that comes along with it. In addition, there's all that pollution, right? Not just all the burning, but I'll give you an example of something I never knew. But when planes take off from aircraft carriers, sometimes there is a problem. Actually, it's more often than not. It happens more frequently than people imagine because they never, publish those videos of accidents, right? No, they're just going to show you the successful takeoff. So if there is a problem right after they take off, they have to land again. Well, the procedure is that you have to dump all your ordnance, right? Your bombs and missiles and stuff, and your fuel. Yes, you have to dump all your fuel into the ocean. That stuff is toxic. And so it's extremely polluting. And also, it gives a lot of political power where it shouldn't be to weapons manufacturers, the military industrial complex. If all those keyboard warriors, if all those virtue signalers, and I know a lot of them, unfortunately, if they had to go themselves, then they would quickly realize that it's not what people think. The conditions are awful. It's just miserable. I've talked about this before, but a good war movie is a good war movie is an anti-war movie because it just shows you how there's no glory there at all. It's just survival, and particularly in order to carry out your duty as a soldier, you kind of have to become something different. This is in most cases. Some people, not so much. But for the average person, you have to turn into something which can carry out the job. And that is where you get a lot of the war crimes, the atrocities that you often hear about. And it's because, well, what do you expect? You put these people in a live or die situation. What do you think? How do you think they're going to behave? And for a lot of people, right, who are pressed into service, who are forced to do this kind of stuff, they can't turn it off, right? Either they can't turn it on and they don't get very far, or they can't turn it off. It's a very serious problem. So I was listening to Ron Paul talk about all this, and then it reminded me of the mandatory service in Korea. When I was over there, that was the big hot topic in every conversation of when you had to go fulfill your service. Are you going to go in the middle of college, after you graduate, before you go to college? At least among the people that I talk to, right? So there are people who um, probably went right out of high school because they weren't going to go to college, but I didn't know too many of those people, right? So between the ages of 18 and 35, ever since 1957, everyone has to perform or go into mandatory military service unless there's an exception, and we'll get into that in a little bit. And so when I went to Korea to study, I still had my Korean citizenship because my father, he wanted us to remember our Korean identity. And so he registered us in Korea, even though we were born in America. And so I was given notice that I would have to be drafted unless, and perform my mandatory military service unless, I renounced my Korean citizenship, which I had to do right away because they were coming for me, right? And so, but I did get to hear a lot of the stories of people who had to go through their mandatory military service. And so some people, they got so scared uh, because if you were one of the unfortunate few who were sent to the 38th parallel, right, and that's the border between North and South Korea, they still were doing night patrols in the 1990s. And so people often were killed there. And so they played mind games on each other, apparently. And so some soldiers commit suicide. and the 38th parallel. And that was like the worst assignment. If you were in the Army, the worst assignment was the 38th parallel. One of the best assignments was to get into the Katusa, Katusa, and that stands for Korean Augmentation to the U.S. Army. So Korean soldiers who could speak English really, really well, they were attached as kind of a liaison to the U.S. Army. Um, so you have to keep in mind that Korean military training and Korean military life, it's harsh. And one of the reasons why it's harsh is because, they're poor. It's a poorer country. And so the conditions and the kind of living conditions they can provide for the soldier is not as nice as it is here in the United States. Right. So Katusa would be the best gig that you could get to fulfill your military service. Another one was National Guard, right? They call it Bangi, but I understood it to be kind of National Guard, where you are doing more localized stuff. So you can actually be stationed close to your home. But if you are healthy, then you are a foot soldier, right? The exceptions would be if you're too skinny, too fat, you have bad eyesight, or something's wrong with your trigger finger. And I looked it up, and it said that people who try to seek exemptions, right? And this is all fraudulent, understand, right? Because the level of skinny and the level of fat that you have to achieve to get an exemption is just so off the chart. It's so unhealthy that you got to ask yourself, is it worth it? Some people can't afford all of the food that they need to buy in order to get that fat, right? So 37% of exemptions were because of extreme weight loss or gain. Fabrication of mental illness, right? These are the fraud cases. Fabrication of mental illness was 23%. Deliberate full body tattoos. So if you got a full body tattoo, you were exempt. But and that was 20%. 20% of people who tried to get out of their military service, they did it by getting a full body tattoo. Number one, you got to realize that at the time, getting a tattoos in Korea were just simply not, you didn't do that. And then, of course, full body tattoos has that connotation of being in the Yakuza or the Japanese mob. And so you didn't want to do that either. You're not going to get married, kind of thing, right? And then someone who actually is a gangster will see you try to, think that you're posing, you're pretending to be a gangster, and they'll take you out. But I just was, astounded. Now, I met people who tried the too fat, tried the too skinny, and they just couldn't do it. And I'm talking, you got to be morbidly, massively obese, which is really hard to do on a Korean diet when you're over there. You'll know what I mean. It's kind of easy to do it in America, but not so simple in Korea. Bad eyesight. I know people who would stare at lasers all day to try to ruin their eyesight so they can get out of this mandatory service. I even met one guy, right? His father cut his finger off when he was, I don't know, 6 years old or something like that. His father cut his finger off, right? His trigger finger, so that way he would get an exemption. All of that to get out of the military service. Now, this, of course, is the lower income method of getting exemption, right? If you were wealthier, you got out of the country, either by studying abroad or by getting out of the country when you were still young so that you change your citizenship when you're abroad, right? I've met a lot of people who did that as well. So that's what happens, right? A lot of people just trying to do everything they can to avoid military service. It results in a distorted economy, a distorted population, 18 months in the army, which means 18 months you got to put your life on hold, which might not seem like a lot to people who've wasted a lot of time in their own life, but it is a lot for people who are on a career path. They are 18 months behind anyone else who didn't have to go. You lose seniority, you lose a lot as a result, right? Seniority being the most, especially getting a job. You're now a year and a half behind everyone else, and it results in pay scale, who you have to bow to, who you have to defer to, all of that other stuff. It's longer for the Navy and the Air Force, probably because it's not as rigorous. And so there are many, many distortions all throughout society. Then there's the shame element. Why didn't you go? Why couldn't you go? Lots of things like this. And then, of course, you have the rich and powerful having exemptions for their own family, while the poor kids have to go into service, which is the same everywhere, all over the world. But at the end of the day, this kind of coerced military service makes a country poorer, right? And on top of the fact that our country, the United States, is already broke, right? They don't have the equipment for today's modern warfare. Uh, I I just, part of my anger is the fact that we're talking all this war when the United States is not ready for war, don't have the manpower, don't have the equipment. And I almost feel like they're setting up the slaughter so they can use nukes. Seriously? It's just kind of out of my mind. Like, you got to be kidding me. But these people are that idiotic, that stupid. They might actually be thinking this way. For what? Right? For what end? For what goal? For what outcome? To hide the debt problem? To hide power struggles? To finally scratch that itch of revenge against a country that, wronged your family 100 years ago? I don't know, some ridiculous reason which has nothing to do with us. Maybe it's a war. They want a war to cancel the elections. Personally, I feel that, if someone was actually made unalive in Pennsylvania not that long ago, we would already be at war. So I will repeat that quote. In closing, war is a massacre of people who don't know each other for the profit of people who know each other, but don't massacre each other. It's just sorry if it sounds more like a rant, but we got to wake up. We got to really start trying to get people to realize just how awful the war option is, that there are other alternatives, and we just have to start thinking about them and get people off this like mindless, zealous, patriotic stupidity that somehow going to war makes you a good American. It's just so weird. And so I just can't get my head around it. So I'm doing my part, trying to make all the kids at my school be anti-war, and hopefully you're doing the same wherever you are. I will talk to you next time.